Miles Davis had built his reputation on being emotionally untouchable, the cool, distant jazz legend who never showed weakness. But when Billie Holiday sang Strange Fruits in that small Harlem club in 1959, something inside Miles completely shattered. What happened next revealed a side of Miles Davis that nobody had ever seen before. It was October 15, 1959, and the Smalls Paradise Club in Harlem was packed with the usual late-night crowd of musicians, writers, and jazz devotees who gathered to hear the music that couldn't be found anywhere else in the city. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of anticipation that came when word spread that something special was about to happen. Miles Davis sat alone at a corner table, nursing his usual bourbon and keeping his characteristic distance from the crowd. At 33, Miles had already established himself as one of the most innovative voices in jazz, but he had also cultivated a reputation for emotional coldness that was both his trademark and his shield. Miles didn't socialize. He didn't smile for audiences. He rarely spoke to other musicians beyond what was necessary for the music. Those who knew him understood that this distance wasn't arrogance, it was protection. Miles had learned early in life that showing vulnerability was dangerous, and he had constructed an impenetrable wall around his emotions that had served him well in the brutal world of professional jazz. But tonight, that wall was about to crumble completely. The reason Miles was at Smalls Paradise wasn't for socializing or networking. He was there because he'd heard that Billie Holiday was making one of her increasingly rare club appearances, and Miles had a complicated relationship with Lady Day that went back more than a decade. Billie Holiday was 44 years old in 1959, and the years had not been kind to her. Decades of addiction, abusive relationships, and encounters with law enforcement had taken their toll on her voice and her health. But there was something about Billie's pain that translated into the most emotionally devastating performances in jazz history. Miles understood Billie's pain in ways that most people couldn't. Like her, he had grown up in a world that was hostile to his very existence as a black artist. Like her, he had used music as both an escape from and an expression of that pain. And like her, he had learned to bury his emotions so deep that most people assumed he didn't have any. The difference was that Billie wore her pain openly, letting it pour out through her voice in ways that left audiences emotionally devastated. Miles had chosen the opposite path, channeling his pain into a cool, controlled musical style that revealed nothing of what he was feeling inside. When Billie took the small stage at Smalls Paradise that night, she looked fragile and worn, but her presence still commanded the room. She had lost weight, and her famous gardenias had been replaced by a simple black dress that seemed to absorb the stage lights. But when she approached the microphone, something shifted in the atmosphere of the club. For her first few songs, Billie performed some of her more familiar material standards that the audience expected, and that allowed her to warm up both her voice and the room. Miles watched from his corner table, appreciating the technical skill she displayed even in her diminished state, but not yet emotionally engaged. Then Billie did something that changed the entire evening. She looked directly at Miles across the crowded club, and their eyes met for a moment that seemed to last much longer than it actually did. In that look, Miles saw recognition, not of his fame or his musical achievements, but of his pain. Billie had seen through the cool exterior to the hurt that Miles kept hidden, and she was about to do something that would force him to confront it. Without announcing it to the audience, Billie changed her planned set list. She turned to her piano player and whispered something that made him look surprised, then concerned. He nodded reluctantly and began playing the haunting introduction to Strange Fruits, the song that had made Billie famous and that had also made her a target for law enforcement and racist violence throughout her career. Strange Fruits wasn't just a song, it was a devastating indictment of lynching in the American South. A piece of music so powerful and politically charged that many venues refused to allow Billie to perform it. The song required Billie to channel not just her own pain but the collective pain of her entire race, and performing it always took something out of her that she could never get back. But that night, Billie wasn't singing Strange Fruits for the audience at Smalls Paradise. She was singing it for Miles Davis, and both of them knew it. As Billie began to sing, something extraordinary happened in that small Harlem club. Her voice, weakened by years of abuse and addiction, somehow found a power and clarity that transcended her physical limitations. Every word she sang seemed to carry the weight of personal experience. Every note conveyed pain that was both specific and universal. Miles found himself unable to look away. He had heard Strange Fruits many times before. Every jazz musician knew the song and respected its power. But he had never heard it performed with this level of raw emotional honesty. Billie was holding nothing back, letting her voice crack when it needed to crack, letting her pain show in ways that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. As the song progressed, something began happening inside Miles that he didn't understand and couldn't control. The walls he had built around his emotions were starting to crack, and memories that he had buried for years were beginning to surface. He remembered being 7 years old in East St. Louis, watching his mother cry when his father left for weeks at a time without explanation. He remembered the fear in his parents' voices when they discussed the violence that periodically erupted against black families in their neighborhood. He remembered his own encounters with racism as a young musician, the humiliation of being denied service at restaurants, the constant awareness that his talent meant nothing if white people decided they didn't want to hear it. All of these memories had been buried beneath years of professional success and carefully constructed emotional distance. But Billie's voice was unlocking something that Miles had thought was safely contained, and he was powerless to stop it. When Billie reached the most devastating part of the song, the images of bodies hanging from trees, the casual cruelty of racial violence, Miles felt something inside him break completely. For the first time since childhood, Miles Davis began to cry. It started as just a tightening in his throat, a burning behind his eyes that he tried to control through sheer willpower. But Billie's voice was relentless, stripping away every defense he had constructed, reaching into places in his soul that he had forgotten existed. The tears came slowly at first, then with increasing intensity, until Miles was openly weeping at his corner table in full view of the other patrons at Small's Paradise. The people sitting near Miles were stunned. This was the man known throughout the jazz world for his emotional coolness, the musician who performed with his back turned to audiences, the artist who had made a career out of revealing nothing of his inner life. And here he was, completely vulnerable, completely broken down by a 3-minute song. But Billie wasn't finished with Miles yet. After Strange Fruits ended to stunned silence, she looked at Miles again and saw what her song had done to him. Instead of moving on to something lighter, she made another devastating choice. She began singing Gloomy Sunday, the song that had been nicknamed the suicide song because of its almost unbearable sadness. If Strange Fruits had cracked Miles's emotional walls, Gloomy Sunday was going to demolish them completely. The song, originally written in Hungarian and later adapted into English, was a meditation on death and despair so profound that it had been banned from radio stations around the world. In Billie's interpretation, it became something even more devastating, the personal statement about the pain of living when life had become too much to bear. As Billie sang about dreams that would never come true and love that would never return, Miles felt every word as if it had been written specifically about his own life. He thought about the relationships he had destroyed through his emotional distance, the connections he had refused to make because vulnerability was too dangerous, the price he had paid for his success and his survival. By the time Billie finished Gloomy Sunday, Miles was completely destroyed. He was crying openly, his carefully constructed persona completely shattered, his reputation for coolness in ruins for anyone who was watching. But something remarkable happened in that moment of complete vulnerability. Instead of losing respect for Miles, the other people in the club began to see him as fully human for the first time. The distance that had always separated Miles from his audiences disappeared, replaced by a recognition that even legends could be broken by the right combination of art and truth. When Billie's set ended, she walked directly to Miles's table. Without saying a word, she sat down across from him and reached across the table to take his hand. For several minutes they sat together in silence while Miles composed himself and the rest of the club gave them the privacy that such a moment required. Finally, Billie spoke. Her voice was gentle, worn down by the performance she had just given. "I know," she said simply. "I know." Miles looked at her through eyes that were still wet with tears, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to be seen completely. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you put all that pain into the music and survive it?" Billie smiled sadly. "Sometimes I don't think I do survive it," she said. "But the music needs it. The people need to hear it. If we don't tell them about the pain, who will?" They talked for another hour, two of jazz's most tortured souls sharing experiences and insights that neither had ever discussed with anyone else. Miles learned that Billie's emotional openness came at a cost that was almost unbearable, but she continued to perform with that level of honesty because she believed that her pain could help other people understand their own. Miles, meanwhile, shared something he had never told anyone: that his emotional distance wasn't just protection, it was also a form of cowardice. He had been afraid that if he let people see his real emotions, they would use that vulnerability against him. But in building walls to protect himself, he had also cut himself off from the very connections that could have given his life meaning. When Miles finally left Small's Paradise that night, he was a changed man. The emotional breakdown that Billie had triggered had shown him something about himself that he couldn't ignore. His cool facade wasn't strength, it was fear, and that fear was preventing him from creating the kind of music he was truly capable of making. The impact of that night showed up almost immediately in Miles's music. Within months, he was recording some of the most emotionally honest music of his career, allowing vulnerability and pain to inform his compositions in ways that made them more powerful than anything he had created before. More importantly, Miles began to change how he related to other people. He was still not an extrovert, still maintained much of his characteristic reserve, but those who worked with him noticed a difference. He was more willing to show appreciation for other musicians, more open to collaborative relationships, more willing to let his guard down in small ways that made him more accessible as both an artist and a human being. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden, but they were real. Miles had learned from Billie Holiday that emotional honesty, while painful, was also the source of the most powerful art. He had seen what it cost her to perform with that level of vulnerability, but he had also seen what it gave to the people who heard it. Billie Holiday died less than 8 months after that night at Small's Paradise, her body finally succumbing to the years of addiction and abuse that had fueled her most devastating performances. When Miles heard the news, he cried again, not just for the loss of a great artist, but for the loss of someone who had shown him that his pain was not something to be hidden, but something to be transformed into art that could touch other people's souls. In interviews years later, Miles would occasionally reference that night at Small's Paradise, though he was never specific about what had happened. He would only say that Billie Holiday had taught him something important about the relationship between pain and art, and that her lesson had changed how he approached both music and life. The people who were in that small Harlem club that night never forgot what they witnessed. They had seen two legends at their most vulnerable, sharing a moment of truth that revealed the human cost of creating art that mattered. They had watched Miles Davis, the coolest man in jazz, break down completely, and in doing so become more real and more powerful than he had ever been while hiding behind his emotional walls. But perhaps most importantly, they had witnessed the kind of artistic courage that Billie Holiday displayed every time she performed, the willingness to use her own pain as a gift to her audience, knowing that it would cost her something she could never recover. That night, at Small's Paradise, became one of those legendary moments in jazz history that people talked about for decades. Not because of what was performed, but because of what was revealed, that even the strongest walls can be broken by the right combination of truth and art, and that sometimes the most important thing an artist can do is show their audience that it's okay to feel everything, even when it hurts. If this powerful story of vulnerability and artistic courage moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that showing emotion isn't weakness. It's the source of our greatest strength. Have you ever had a moment when art completely broke down your defenses? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about the legends who found the courage to be human in front of the world.